Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast, where we make sense of local politics, schools, housing, public safety, the civic issues that impact the life of a San Diego resident. We break it down so you can understand it and make educated decisions.
Everything that goes into our investigative reporting, the journalists, public records requests, the data crunching, and this very show depends on the support of people like you because we're a nonprofit news organization. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to those of you listening on News Radio 600 Kogo. My name is Scott Lewis, and I'm here with my friend Andrew Keatts.
What's up, my dudes?
What's up, brother? Oh my gosh, things are changing.
It occurred to me that the old intro just doesn't work now that there's two dudes here.
That's true. Yeah.
And amiga Sara Libby.
What's up?
How are you?
Also dudes.
Good. So things happened. I went to a costume Halloween party. We don't need to get into your feelings on that because I had a blast. I had so much fun. And that was Saturday night. And the kids were at the grandparents' house. And that was nice. And then I go to bed. We go in, turn in for the night.
And you slept for 8 hours.
No.
Walk us through all of that.
I woke up at 4 a.m. because I just woke up. And I picked up my phone because I knew something might be happening. And I reloaded Voice of San Diego. And we had our new website. And a year of angst and anticipation was all fulfilled in one glorious moment.
I was wondering where you were going with this. Seems like you really didn't need to mention the Halloween costumes at all.
Yeah, it didn't seem to be part of this situation.
You threw me off.
Yeah.
Good job.
I just was setting it in time.
Yeah.
When I think the thing is,
he was setting up that Sunday morning comes after Saturday evening.
It does.
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And it was just I just trying to draw out. It was like Christmas night for me. And I was trying not for a year, for like months, as this was coming closer and closer, I was trying not to get excited about it because I wanted it to happen so bad. And I knew it might not. It might get delayed. It might go awry. And I was trying to just contain all of that and manage my expectations. And I did. For the first time in my whole life, I managed expectations appropriately. And it worked.
It
I
worked
woke
out
up.
for you.
It was a beautiful, new, fast, secure website.
Yeah, the primary distinction between our current site and our previous one is that this one is good and the other one was a piece of garbage.
Well,
Right.
It's fine. It needed to be cleaned up and work faster.
Among other things.
Yeah. Now we have,
And look different and be organized differently.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
now it does.
now it does
It
all
looks
those
great.
things in an improved way
Yeah. So
to the old.
thank you to the firm Mantle, Tristan Loper, our estranged digital manager, still helped with that.
Estranged.
He's in Gainesville, Florida, but he brought the project home.
Birthplace of Tom Petty.
He's a Florida man.
Yeah, he is a Florida man now.
Ashley Lewis provided some valuable design and program management. It worked out so wonderfully.
Yes.
Normally, I would object to talking about an insider thing like the website, but it was so bad, and now it looks so good.
Yes. And that's correct.
Yeah, it's okay. So check it out. Go to voicesandiego.org. Got a lot of good feedback. I've never done a redesign that was 100% well received. I mean, there was some people like, there's some things you need to work on and stuff like that. But like, I used to do redesign. We would go through redesigns and I just pummeled. Like it would be the morning at lunch and I would just be harangued and overwhelmed with, what have you done? You have ruined everything. And this time that didn't happen. And I think it has to do with the fact that it was good.
Yeah.
And that the other one was bad.
Yeah.
It's a
No
good
one
sign.
wanted it to stay.
Yeah. So good now. It's a whole new world. It's a symbolic end of the transformation Voice of San Diego has gone through too. We've completely redone our operations team, and our new COO, Julianne Marco, is something. Just brings a lot of sophistication to the organization. She built a Ferrari of an operations team over here, and it's just a whole new chapter for us.
Ferraris like break down a lot and they're impractical. I don't think it's the best
Like an Audi of an operations team?
Yeah, like a BMW or
Tank.
something. You know?
Okay.
Yeah.
BMW.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
I just don't
Thanks
think it
for
was
honing my metaphor.
You're welcome.
the best car metaphor.
It's just a really high-performing operations team.
Yeah.
There you go.
So anyway, it's a new chapter for San Diego. We're getting all set up for the end of the year push that will be going on, and just a lot of more. We've got a lot of good stories. Fortunately, throughout this whole transformation, we have had great investigative journalism, and I just love the whole team. One of the pieces we wanted to talk about this week is this issue that also needs to be dealt with before the end of the year, and that is that something I learned, and I didn't know, that there are these things called recreation councils across the city. I'm always learning something about how the city works.
Yeah.
And the recreation councils are private nonprofits. They're their own organizations, and they run the a lot of the programs. If you pay to take a class at a recreation center or a yoga class or something, you pay, and that goes to this group.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And that might be changing.
Yeah, so the city attorney released a memo last month that said that money that they have, that they are managing in independent bank accounts unto themselves, is city money, and that there's clearly some legal liabilities about the fact that that is by right city funds that's instead been put into these private accounts, and especially because city money has lots of stipulations and restrictions around how you can spend it. You need to pay prevailing wage. You need to go through procurement processes. People who are city officials need to file Form 700s that specify all of their financial interests so that you can uncover conflicts of interest. And that because these organizations are independent, they weren't being held to all of those same requirements, which created some issues.
And what provoked this? Was this was there a committee meeting and somebody said we should fix this? Was this just something that Mara Elliott, the city attorney, came up with? Like, is it a normal sort of thing to check as they reauthorize these things? Because these councils have to be reauthorized by the end of the year, or else the programs they run might be interrupted.
Right, and the city attorney has said that they won't be reauthorizing these permits at the start of next year, that they will not do that because of all of these legal issues that they identified in their memo. Interestingly, also, the council, the issue, so the city attorney's memo raises this issue, and then it goes to city council this week. It didn't go to council committees. It went right to the city council. City council said, basically, we haven't figured all of this out yet. Let's slow down. Let's send it to the city council, or let's send it to the council committee, and try to do this in a more deliberative way.
Right.
And so that's going to happen now, and we'll see how this proposal changes. But all of it is made more difficult by the fact that there's kind of a deadline here, that the city attorney has said, come the start of the new year, we won't be signing off on these permits, which means this thing's going to have to change anyway.
And is this something that this reauthorization has happened every year, more or less, without incident?
Yeah.
Until
For like 40 years.
Until we got a
This
city
is the-
attorney who likes to drop hot memos.
Yeah, and there's all these other elements to it that are kind of up in the air. For instance, the city has said we're going to create new accounts for each neighborhood. Your recreation center will still get to keep all of that money locally. But there's no indication in the memo that that's a legal requirement. That's just something that has been proposed as the policy for how they're going to fix this.
Nor is it indicated that those accounts will be as easily sort of accessed by these local rec centers, right? Or
well, that's part of the thing. Is like right now, if the rec center has this money and they think they want to resod the field, they can just contract with somebody and resod the field. And
now it has to go through the whole city.
Now
thing?
it has to go through a city process. Right?
Wow. So I was at a Kiwanis club in Tierra Santa speaking on Thursday, and this was a hot topic.
Yeah.
And
well, that's you. Sorry to interrupt you, but in case it isn't clear, these people who are on these recreation center boards, this is like the most involved. These are the most involved constituents in the city. These are the people who are on planning groups, that are on these recreation councils. These are not your passive San Diego citizens. These are really active people, which is perhaps why it's not all that surprising that the city council voted not to act on the proposal this week and to try to slow things down.
And there was some concern among them that the city was trying to seize the money to redistribute it, because there are some of these rec councils that have $500,000, and there's some that have like $15,000.
Well, not even so. The spread. This is the actual spread. The Carmel Valley Council at the start of the year had over $400,000, and Stockton had $51.
Okay,
$51.
5-1. So this is a pretty gigantic spread.
So what they were worried about is that this was an attempt to take that money from something like Carmel Valley and make sure that it was more equally distributed. But a lot of that's philanthropy that comes from the local neighborhood, right?
And they've said that the local council district, the local rec centers would still be able to do this independent fundraising. The question is just whether you would have the incentive to do that as aggressively once you've lost the control over it.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of concerns about losing control, losing money. Have you heard anyone pushing back on the actual argument that, no, this is actually above board and we shouldn't have to go through, the various city processes?
Not particularly. I mean, a lot of these people aren't lawyers, so they're not, nor do they have the money to hire lawyers. So they haven't specifically said this legal memo is wrong. The couple things I've heard, one person told me, look, if this is what has to happen, then let's solve the legal issue and bring it into the city. But let's not do a lot of these other things. For instance, where they're going to create a uniform fee structure for what it would cost to do things at these recreation centers that would be the same citywide. And this was somebody who works at whose recreation council is in a low-income neighborhood, and they try to keep those fees really low because of the constituents that they serve. That might be different from Carmel Valley. Meanwhile, Carmel Valley has had, part of the reason that they have so much more money is because they have these pretty robust relationships with soccer leagues and these independent bodies that bring in a lot of money for them, that are probably not something that anyone could do, that the recreation center in Stockton couldn't easily do that. So there's been the push that I've heard is, if this is just a legal issue, let's just clean up the legal issue and not make all these policy decisions at the same time.
So it's going to be fascinating because they basically have a month and a half to figure this out.
You might remember, if you follow the city, that not many things get done in a month and a half.
No, nothing. And one of those, for example, is
that was a great segue.
Woo!
One of those is this vacation rental thing we've been following. This has become one of the most fierce debates, discussions, and issues I've followed in San Diego for a long time. You have, of course, the opponents of vacation rentals who are worried about the quality of their neighborhood. We've had the Airbnb guy here. I asked him about the worry that some people have about these mini hotels, as they call them, propping up in their neighborhood. And then on the other side, you have people who are making money, sometimes making ends meet, renting out rooms of their houses, but then others who are renting out their whole homes to visitors who come in, and people like staying at those things. So there's a whole interesting, sort of new thing happening, and then this protectiveness of the neighbors that they want to keep their neighborhood the way it is. And so this debate has clashed, and there was this really great moment at the University Heights Community Association. Chris Ward shows up there. He's the councilman who came up with this idea to or helped put together a sort of plan to kind of bring everybody together. It would give permits to everybody who wanted to do this. You'd have to apply for a permit, and it would require a 3-night minimum stay, which would eliminate some of the people who come in just for the night, of course. And it would fund enforcement of nuisances. If the issue is nuisance, let's fund enforcement of the nuisance, right? So he's at the University Heights Community Association, and the anti-folks just flood it and start heckling and asking questions. And the guy who wrote about it for the newsletter of the University Heights Community Association put it really well. Many questions were presented in a civil manner, But some audience members delivered their questions with a heap of emotion, which many found to be an unpersuasive method of delivery.
Many.
I just found that delightful.
Probably not him. I don't think he's one of those many.
No, he felt it was not persuasive that they were making their case.
That's what I'm kidding.
And the point, look, Ward is feeling the heat on this issue, and he's really getting it, I think, because Councilman Chris Keatts was all for it, all very liberal policy on that. Barbara Bree, on the other hand, and Lori Zaff have been on the other side of restriction for them. But this whole issue needed somebody in the middle to kind of pick a side, maybe like the mayor. The mayor wouldn't. So Ward stepped into this leadership vacuum, picked a side, and said, yeah, we're going to allow these, but let's fund enforcement, right?
It's interesting that, so a 4-person memo proposes this new framework. And Ward really quickly and conclusively becomes the face of it and becomes the object of derision from the anti-Airbnb side of things. And it's interesting because he was just one of 4 people. They could have chosen any of the other 3 who signed the memo. David Alvarez could have been the person who they directed their ire at, but it wasn't. It was Chris Ward. Do you have any idea why specifically that was?
He took the step of championing it. He did an op-ed for our site, for example, that said this is why this should happen. And he was targeted really hard by the hotel workers union and others to not do this. And in fact, they felt like he had undercut them because he was they expected Barbara Bree to lead the way on it. And I don't know exactly why he got it, but I think it's mostly because they wanted to target somebody on the left. He stood up as the one to do this, and he and the left really got mobilized. In some ways, this hotel workers union and the building trades have mobilized against that compromise, that idea of permitting them all, and mobilized for the Barbara Bree plan.
One thing I thought was interesting in your story on this is somebody from the Hotel Workers Union made this same point that we saw, I think Lori Zaff made a few weeks ago, that Ward should defer to the council member who is maybe most impacted by this, and she suggested that was Barbara Bree. Mm-hmm. Conveniently, Barbara Bree has the same position as she does. But it's not as if there are no Airbnbs in North Park, certainly. And so, I mean, there are plenty of Airbnbs in Chris Ward's district.
Thousands, in fact. In fact, they were mad at him for not knowing just how many thousands there were in his district. And the Hotel Workers Union is led by a woman who lives next to a vacation rental that she finds D3? She finds quite annoying. And so it's become very personal. She, along with these opponents of vacation rental, are making the point that this is just lobbyist driven. They're that he's just a victim of the lobbyist persuasion and money and all that. And it's just it's gotten really nasty, especially in this little intra-left fight. And so I don't know how it's going to resolve itself. All right. This week's hero, I did another piece of journalism this week about a woman named Diana Ocampo, and I featured her as part of our I Made It in San Diego podcast. Check that out. Go I Made It in San Diego in your podcast feed there. And wonderful story, just a really inspiring story of a woman who built a business, lost it all, and then built something new. And just that moment in people's lives, I really focus on a lot of where they just don't know what to do. And they pull whatever resources they have, whatever advice they can pull together, whatever money they can pull together to get something else going, I think is really inspiring. So if you want to listen to a story like that, I highly recommend that I Made It in San Diego post. Our GOAT of the week.
You lose! Good day, sir!
So this one goes to a familiar person in this slot, former district attorney and former judge, as she's been emphasizing lately, Bonnie Dumanis. So there was a filing in that case about Jose Susumu Asano Matsura. He's been sentenced to 3 years in prison for illegally donating to campaigns, including hers, including Nathan Fletcher's and a couple others in town, or tried to get Nathan Fletcher's and Bob Filner's. And he's serving this time because foreign nationals are not allowed to donate. And part of the issue has been that she's never been clear about her relationship with this man. She met him a couple times, never remembers what they talked about.
Yeah, or how many times they met, or the fact that she wrote his son a college recommendation.
Yeah. The nature of their relationship is perpetually changing. The number of times they met, how well they're known, what was specifically known about this person. And now he's going to jail, and she has still not paid any price for this at all.
Yeah, and her explanation of their relationship, and one of the reasons this came up again last week, is that he claims that he told her he was a foreign national, not allowed to donate to campaigns, and she says, no, that's not true. It's just a Hail Mary he's trying to make. But how does she know what he said in these meetings if she doesn't remember the meeting? One of the questions that we asked is she won't talk about what they discussed. She still hasn't talked about whether she knew that he was trying to put this money in, and yeah, that's part of the frustration. Is basically her answers on this whole case have been that she's just dangerously ignorant of the operations of the things that she's running, or she's lying, which is just so. Those are the only two choices on this matter, and yeah, it's going to go this whole time, never being resolved before she runs for another office. All right, this has been the Voice of San Diego on podcast and on radio, done in partnership with our friends at News Radio 600 Coke. This Voice of San Diego podcast is brought to you by Manolatos Nelson Murphy Advertising and Public Relations. M&M is run by Tony Manolatos, Bob Nelson, and Kelly Murphy Lamkin, who bring decades of advertising and public relations experience to businesses, nonprofits, government agencies, and campaigns. M&M bridges the gap between clients and the people whose influence matters most. M&M is a full-service agency that helps clients develop their strategy and launch cost-effective tactics. The firm specializes in public affairs and advertising with an emphasis on media relations, crisis communications, community outreach, coalition building, broadcast, print, direct mail, and digital advertising. Our reporters at Voice of San Diego have definitely heard from Tony and Bob over the years. Tony, Bob, and Kelly are supporters of Voice of San Diego, and you can learn more about their firm at mnmadpr.com. That's mnmadpr.com. Okay, we're back. This is the Voice of San Diego podcast with Andrew Keatts, Sara Libby, and me, Scott Lewis. I'm Scott Lewis. This is the part of the show where I talk to you about supporting Voice of San Diego. All of these things that we do here are important and difficult and cost money, from parking to salaries. And we make that all happen because we've convinced enough people that it's worth doing. And that's about 2,700 members, several foundations and corporate sponsors. But it also means that people like you need to help. And so we're going to be starting our end of the year contribution drive. And if you want to get a head start on that, we very much appreciate that. Go to voiceofsandiego.org/donate. And if you're a company and you're realizing just how powerful and important this podcast is, and you want to be a part of it and have your company recognized and promoted, please let us know. Or you're a nonprofit or whatever initiative you have going, that'd be great. You can contact Kinsey at kinsee@voiceofsandiego.org. We're joined in the great Voice San Diego podcast studio in downtown San Diego. Probably the most popular, most impressive podcast studio in downtown San Diego, I think.
That we know of.
Yeah.
That's possible that somebody else is recording a podcast down here that we don't know about.
No,
okay.
We're good.
All
That's the most. And we're joined here by Richard Bailey. He's the mayor of Coronado. So you made it over the bridge, all right?
We did, safe and sound.
Yeah.
From overseas.
It was a long journey.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit, just catch us up. How long have you been mayor of Coronado?
I was elected to the mayor's spot back in November of 2016, so coming up on 1 year now. And
Okay.
prior to that, I was on the city council for 4 years.
Okay. A longtime resident of Coronado? Or?
Actually, not too long. San Diego native, born and raised, and then I moved over to Coronado back in 2008.
It's okay over there.
It's not bad.
Yeah.
It's not bad. We make do.
Yeah. All right. So we got to know you based on Andy here's coverage of the San Diego Association of Governments. You have a seat on that board, right? Coronado just has one seat, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So all of the cities within the county have a representative from their city on that board, and I'm Coronado's representative.
Okay. How's it going?
It's going well. It's been an interesting process. There's been a pretty steep learning curve over this first year, but I'm enjoying it. I see that there's a lot of opportunity for reform, and I think The Voice did a great job of presenting us with a lot of those opportunities.
And there's some interesting discussions going on right now. Do you want to try to set this up? A question?
Well, yeah. So you've got a couple different threads that you've been dealing with at the SANDAG board the last few weeks. One of those, maybe you could help walk us through your perspective on this, is SANDAG each year puts out an updated plan of finance for Transnet. This is the tax measure that was approved by voters back in 2004, specifies all the different projects that are going to be paid for, and Transnet sort of outlines how the funding for that process is going, and what some of the long-term needs are going to be for revenue and what the costs are going to be and all that sort of thing. And so you have, in the last about let's say a month, maybe 6 weeks, started voicing some concerns on the board about how that document is put together and some of the assumptions that go into it. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your concerns with the way SANDAG produces that long-term outline for how it's going to complete all of the major projects in Transnet?
Yeah, absolutely. So SANDAG is a fairly complicated agency. When I say complicated, I mean that it's complicated because there are a lot of different reporting requirements that SANDAG has to abide by. They have to come up with a bunch of different documents that's mandated by the federal government. And so everything from the regional plan to the RTIP to the plan of finance to the annual budget, et cetera, you have all these various documents that are out there. And the one that you're speaking to right now is the plan of finance that has specifically to do with that 2004 proposition that increased sales tax by 0.5 cent for the next 40 years. And in that proposition, essentially what we told voters was that if you extend this sales tax for 40 years, we will be able to fund a list of a few dozen projects, and everything ranging from some transit projects to some roads and highways. We'll also be able to give some monies to the municipalities for the maintenance of their roads. And along with this funding of a 0.5 cent sales tax, we anticipated receiving matching funds to some degree from the state and the federal government, so we could leverage that tax revenue that was coming into SANDAG and actually be able to do more with it. Now, we only anticipated receiving a 1-to-1 matching ratio. What we have found is that we have been overestimating the amount of revenue that would be generated from that sales tax increase and underestimating our construction costs to actually complete these projects. And what's happened over the past few years, and it's really only been identified as recently as December of 2016, is that we now have this multi-billion-dollar, essentially a shortfall that we didn't originally anticipate. And I don't think it wasn't made perfectly clear to the board back in December of 2016 that this shortfall existed. It was something that staff seemed to kind of just gloss over very quickly in one board meeting, and it really didn't receive a lot of attention until the Voice of San Diego started reporting on it. So my main concern is making sure that the public and the board is aware that we have this large shortfall in place, and that in order to complete these projects, we're going to have to receive a much higher matching fund ratio than we originally anticipated, and or perhaps additional tax revenues in the future.
Can I boil it down just a little bit more and say we might be coming closer to a reckoning with voters that says this list of projects that were promised in 2004 and others that have been developed and decided on, we might not be able to deliver them.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So what they've done now, and what you pointed out at this board meeting 6 weeks ago, was as that gap has grown, as the difference between what's going to come in locally and what the ultimate cost is going to be, as that gap has grown, the assumptions about how much we'll be able to get from the state and feds have just grown to match it. So that when we used to assume that we would need $10 billion in outside funds to complete the program, we now anticipate getting $18 billion. And there hasn't been necessarily the changes at the state or federal level to justify that. It's just kind of been an assumption made matching the need. Is that basically fair?
That's correct. So whenever SANDAG comes up with a budget or a forward-looking plan for how much money it will cost to complete these projects, the cost to complete these projects will always match our anticipated revenues. And so we will always have a plug figure in there, whether it's a few $1 billion or $17 billion, we'll always have that plug figure in there. And it's a sign that we are anticipating this revenue which has yet to be identified. And because it is yet to be identified, there's a chance, a very strong chance, that we might not be able to finish all of those projects. And that's, if I'm as a taxpayer in San Diego County, that's a concern of mine, because in 2004, when voters were promised this list of projects, to know that they might not be able to come to fruition, I think that's something that the board is going to have to deal with, and we need to be as transparent as possible with the public.
I think that this is another instance in San Diego that we deal with between this balance, this appropriate balance between confidence and vulnerability. Like that they don't want to admit in some ways that maybe they're going to come in short, even though there's no evidence that they stole the money or that they lost the money or that it was spent unwisely. It just hasn't come in at what they thought it would. And the big tension has been about whether they would ever just recognize that and confront voters with that, right? And so how do you understand that balance of like, maybe there is a way to be vulnerable about it, to be honest about that, and not have that be a negative? Do you understand that my point on that?
Absolutely. I think in this day and age, voters are yearning for political leaders to just be honest with them. I think it is a very difficult conversation for the SANDAG staff and the SANDAG board to have, because essentially they're acknowledging that there was an error in our forecast dating all the way back to 2004, which overstated our revenues. And no one wants to point back 14 years and pin it on someone or say, hey, gosh, we really got it wrong. But the fact of the matter is, we got it wrong. I don't think anyone was nefarious with their intent. I certainly don't suspect there's any corruption taking place there. I think it was simply a modeling error. And when the modeling error was discovered and we learned that we were overestimating some of our revenues that we anticipated coming in over the next 40 years, when we learned we were overestimating those revenues, the SANDAG staff, I don't believe, wanted to be very forthright with that information. And I think it was because, since it was a difficult conversation to have, I think that we weren't as honest with the public as we could have been, or at least as transparent with the public as we could have been.
And it's worth noting at that time, they were asking for another tax increase. So that the timing of it, not being honest about it, is bad in its own right. But it's especially bad if you're withholding this information at the very time that you're asking people to approve a new tax increase with a new set of promises for projects, when in fact there's a pretty high likelihood that some of that money, at least some of that money, is going to go back to those old promises.
Absolutely. And the same modeling error which contributed to the tax revenues from 2004 being overstated was also included within Measure A from 2016, which was supposed to be a new source of funding. But we now know that model overstated future tax revenues as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned that December 2016 meeting. So that December 2016 meeting was last year. This was when they came in and they said there were these news reports. They were talking about my news reports. They didn't say that, though. There were these news reports that suggested that there were problems with our modeling. We took a look. In fact, there were some problems. They bought a new forecast, and they said, we've adjusted the forecast to represent this new thing. And that's when the really wide gap opened up with how much money they needed to get from state and federal sources. I did a pretty snarky story a couple months ago talking about what level of questioning took place at the board when staff made that acknowledgement, which is no one at the board said anything. Laura Zaff attempted to ask one question. She was told by Chair Ron Roberts that they didn't have enough time. She said it's fine, don't worry about it, and then that was it. So you have started asking questions at the board and pushing for more clarity on why these assumptions are being made and what the basis for these assumptions has been. I'm interested, how responsive or unresponsive do you think staff has been as you've been pushing these questions? And what has been your sense of how the rest of the board has reacted to something that is somebody kind of getting out of this the sort of standard talking points from SANDAG? Sure.
Well, I want to address a few things. I made a statement on another media outlet a few weeks ago that I think SANDAG is very much a staff-driven organization. And I think there have been many instances where the board essentially rubber stamped what staff put in front of them. And when I say that SANDAG is a staff-driven organization, that is not an indictment of the staff. If anything, it's somewhat of an indictment of the board. And I say that pointing the finger squarely at myself as well. This position, being an elected official, for the vast majority of us in San Diego County, it's a part-time role. It's a part-time role. So in addition to representing our cities at our respective city council meetings, we also serve on a bunch of other agency boards throughout the county, and SANDAG is one of those. SANDAG is a complicated agency. It's very difficult to wrap your arms around everything that's going on. And so there are many instances where we are, as board members, relying on the information that staff puts in front of us. We are in a position where we have to trust what they are telling us. And so I think it's incumbent upon staff to make it crystal clear when there are problems that they have identified. And going back to that December 2016 meeting where we started noticing this gap just widening, there are two components to the plan of finance. There are the costs and there are the revenues. The costs that were identified in that plan of finance increased by 40% from the previous year, and revenues were going down about 15% from the previous year. A 40% increase in capital costs for the remaining projects, you would expect to receive a lot of attention from staff. You would expect staff to say, hey, board, you really need to pay attention to this. This is a big problem on the horizon that is going to necessitate future revenues coming in that we don't right now, that we have not yet identified. And yet the staff presentation only spent about 12 seconds discussing the increase in the capital costs.
You pulled out a stopwatch and actually timed it?
Right, yeah, it's available online. Yeah. The bottom line is there just wasn't a thorough presentation by staff that actually spoke to those capital costs. I firmly believe that every member of the board really wants to do a good job. They really believe in developing the best transportation network possible to move people and goods throughout our county. I think everyone on the board is a good person. I think everyone on staff, at the SANDAG staff, is a good person. They're all well-intentioned. But I think that getting back to, it's a very difficult conversation to have when you have to acknowledge that, hey, board, we got this wrong. We got this wrong dating all the way back to 2004. And so because we haven't been very forthright with what we got wrong and how the magnitude of the error, it's been difficult for the board to really understand the magnitude of the error because we have to rely so much on staff. So over the past several weeks, I have been raising a lot of these questions. And, generally I have found staff to be fairly responsive. I haven't always found their answers to be very direct. For example, at the last board meeting, I asked the basic question, is it a fair assessment to say that SANDAG overestimated the revenue that would be generated from the Proposition A sales tax extension in 2004? And I received a very long-winded answer that essentially was, no, not so much. Not so much. We were able to receive a much higher matching ratio, received more funds than we originally anticipated from other sources. But the fact of the matter is, the answer is yes. We did overestimate the revenue. It said so in an internal investigation that the board pushed for back in February of this year. The answer just should have been yes, as simple as that. Yes, we overestimated the revenue, and here's by how much. But I think
here's what we can do about it.
And here's what we can do about it. Here are potential options to fill that gap. We can either reduce the number of projects, we can reduce the scope of those projects, or we can seek additional tax revenues from other sources.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing is that maybe people might not realize this, but when that unidentified sources that like, oh, well, we'll need to get this money from other places, that doesn't just materialize out of thin air. If you're going to say, well, we used to think we were going to need to come up with $10 billion from the state and the feds. Now we need to get $18 billion. That could be a call to action. You could take that to the board and say, guys, we need almost twice as much money as we were anticipating just 2 years ago. And getting that much money is going to require some proactive decisions from you, from us. It might change our project mix that we, can push forward some more projects that might be more competitive for those funds. We might need to deputize you to go out on these trips, and
I need to hire Corey Lewandowski.
Yeah, I need to. Right, I might need to. We might need to increase our lobbying budget or whatever. Like To just write it off and say, well, this used to be a 10, but the revenue went down and the cost went up, so now it's an 18, and we'll just assume that it's going to be okay, is not only a way of ducking responsibility, it's also a poor way of ensuring that you actually do what needs to be done to make good on that on that assumption.
Absolutely. Once you've had that difficult conversation, once you've identified squarely, hey, we are here. This is our new reality. It varies. You can quantify the variance from where we were back in 2004 until where we are today. Once you've identified that variance, you now have a problem you can tackle. But before you can tackle that problem, you have to have a real thorough understanding of exactly where you are today. And I think that's where there's been a disconnect between the SANDAG staff and the SANDAG board, that this information hasn't been made very clearly to the board, and so we haven't been able to take that kind of action and have those conversations. All right, well, given our new reality, which projects make the most sense to prioritize accordingly? How should the scope of some of these projects change given our new budget situation, given our new what we expect in the future for revenues?
If we do in fact come in short, which projects are we going to cut?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. How do we build the most efficient transportation system in our county given various scenarios of future funding levels?
So you brought up a dynamic about SANDAG that I think is really interesting apart from just this revenue scandal, and that's that they tend to kind of vote in lockstep all the time and for years on a multitude of different issues, even though they represent different geographic areas, even though you're different members of different parties and have all these different interests. How do you think the public should hold members of the SANDAG board accountable, given that they, do sometimes work part-time? And I just don't see like a mayoral campaign coming down to, well, as a member of the SANDAG board, you didn't scrutinize the staff's report well enough. That just doesn't seem like it would play well to me in like a campaign. But the public does deserve a chance to kind of hold elected officials accountable for what they do on this board. So what do you see as being a step toward that?
Well, in my election for mayor of Coronado, the person I was running against, she's a fellow council member on the council of the city of Coronado, Carrie Downey. She's a wonderful addition to our city council. That issue actually did come up in our race. Now, I don't know how many voters that actually influenced.
Coronado, man.
I think it's a matter of everyone holding each other accountable. Ultimately, the board of SANDAG is supposed to be reflective of what their constituents want and desire. And it's important that the constituents are holding their elected leaders accountable by asking them, well, where were you when the plan of finance was introduced back in December of 2016?
I think like reasonable people can disagree on AB 805, the state law that passed to reform SANDAG, because it contained all these different pieces and it addressed labor and it restructured the board. But one thing that did sort of make sense to me is giving more powers to these mayors who have large staffs. Like you said, you're a part-time mayor and it's all really complicated stuff. Do you think there's merit to this idea that maybe they have more bandwidth to dive into some of these issues and therefore should have more power in decision making?
Not when it comes at the expense of the other jurisdictions. And what you have now is a situation where essentially the city of San Diego and the city of Chula Vista can pretty much push through any type of issue they would like to, perhaps at the expense of the smaller cities. So the way
as long as they come up with 2 more votes.
Correct. As long as they come up with 2 more votes. So out of all the jurisdictions in San Diego County, you essentially would only need 4 jurisdictions to be in favor of a particular issue, and that could make it through. Now, as the governance structure currently stands at this moment, it's much more of a collaborative effort where you do have people working across party lines, across various areas of the region to come up with a situation that works for the entire San Diego County. What AB 805 does, and I do think there are one or two good things in AB 805, but what it does is it almost pits the larger cities against the smaller cities, where you now have the city of San Diego and the city of Chula Vista beginning January 1st of 2018 will be in a situation where if they can just pick off two other jurisdictions, they will be essentially in the driver's seat for controlling transportation throughout our region.
It also, and I don't know if this is necessarily good or bad, but just as an observation, there's some incentives for some of those smaller cities to make themselves that third or fourth vote and to kind of maintain quite a bit of leverage and say, like, look, I'll go. You got my vote.
I'll play ball with you.
I'll play ball with you
right.
if you fund the suicide nets underneath the Coronado Bridge.
Absolutely. That sounds like a great idea, actually.
So what I want to talk to you about that, and we can get out of SANDAG. But just one last SANDAG question is about the direction. What are you going to try to do, and what does it look like as far as leadership? When's a new executive director? That sort of thing. How's the future of SANDAG look?
Sure. So right now we're still in the preliminary steps of finding a new executive director. We have a subcommittee in place that will be identifying the two executive search firms that we'll be hiring to go out and find a new executive director. In terms of the leadership of the board, beginning next year, we will be having a new chairman, and we'll also be having a new first chair. So those decisions will be coming out probably within the next few months. In terms of transportation throughout the region, I think it's really important to keep in mind that what transportation looked like back in 2004 is vastly different, compared to what it looks like today looking forward. No one was talking about autonomous vehicles back in 2004. No one was talking about shared rides like Uber and Lyft. Those weren't even on the radar. And now that they're on the radar and we know they're fast approaching, I think it's very important for this current board, it's going to be very important for the next executive director to ask ourselves, are the projects that we have in the pipeline right now still relevant and will still be relevant 30, 40 years from now when they're finally built? I think there might be some instances where you would say, maybe not so much. And if that's the case, does it really make sense to continue investing money and tax dollars in projects that are likely to be obsolete by the time they're finally completed? So I think we need to be very forward-looking. We really need to try to wrap our arms around how are autonomous vehicles and shared rides going to affect the future of transportation. I think 20 years from now, it is very likely you won't see buses that can carry 60, 70, 80 people. You will see smaller autonomous pods that can carry 6 or 8 people, and they will be making use of our roads and freeways. And that would be a radical shift in how we look at even public transit, for example.
Let's talk about that bridge issue for a second. We did a series years ago about the Coronado Bridge and how attractive it is to some people who are considering suicide, and it's now the largest of its kind without a protection, I think. Is that true? Without some sort of net or some sort of barrier.
The Golden Gate is still considered to be the most prevalent suicide bridge in the country. However, they do have funding in place to install nets, I believe, in 2019 or 2020.
Okay. And so this is something you're very concerned about.
It is, yeah. This has been a big issue of mine. It's become a big issue over the past couple years, in large part thanks to a group of community activists. And if you really don't think you can make a difference, if you don't think one person can make a difference, I got to tell you, this bridge issue is a perfect example of where we really had one or two people that took it upon themselves in Coronado to bring this issue to the attention of the city council, to rally the community behind it. And now we have some of our federal legislators that have signed on to try to help find a solution. And so where we're at right now is, and just to give you a little background, when this issue first came on my radar back in late 2015, early 2016, to be perfectly candid, it wasn't an issue I wanted to touch. I didn't realize how big of an issue it was, but no one wants to be that politician that is voting against preventing suicides, right? It just doesn't look good. Like who wants to be put in that position? But the more I explore the issue, the more I realize that this issue really intersects both transportation and also mental health. back in 2016, we had 19 people jump from the Coronado Bridge. 19 individuals jumped. And the saddest part about this is that when someone jumps from the bridge, 9 times out of 10, when someone jumps, they do it without any hesitation. If you talk to many people in Coronado, they'll tell you that because they've driven across the bridge so many times, many people have actually witnessed this firsthand, where the car will pull up to the very top of the bridge, person will get out of their car, and they'll jump with very little pause. They won't even remember to shut the door. Or sometimes they do. I mean, it's a very strange dynamic to actually witness this, but they tend to do it without any hesitation, and then within 2 minutes, that car is towed, it's pushed back down the bridge, and so traffic continues to flow, and there's very interruption to everyone's everyday life. Very little interruption. But in addition to the 19 people that jumped, there were 35 individuals that went to the top of the bridge, got out of their vehicle, and decided not to jump. And when that happens, the protocol from the California Highway Patrol is to close the bridge down, both westbound and eastbound directions, and try to negotiate, try to talk this person off the ledge, so to speak. And that results in traffic being disrupted throughout our entire South Bay region, because then the only way they can get to and from Coronado is by using the Silver Strand. That happened 35 times last year. So we had 19 suicides. We had 35 attempted suicides resulting in bridge closures. And that's what I mean when I say that this issue really intersects transportation and also mental health. There's a lot of research out there that shows if you can remove the impulsive outlet for someone to commit suicide, they go on to live happy and productive lives. It's just that outlet being available at the wrong moment that leads people to commit suicide.
Yeah, there was an amazing New Yorker story about the Golden Gate Bridge, and I remember it being described as it's like having a gun sitting on your table at all times. It's just there.
Right. There's a big issue with people becoming fixated on a particular object, and that object for many people, unfortunately, has been the Coronado Bridge. And so if you remove that as an outlet, if they aren't fixated on, say, another outlet, say, like a gun or like prescription drugs, they won't actually pursue those other outlets. Once you've removed it, they ultimately decide not to commit suicide.
So what's the hurdle you're facing to get the whether it's the funding or the project plans for what would be the physical inhibition for the suicide?
Sure. So right now it is just the sheer inertia of making any type of change. So the first step to bringing about change is raising awareness, and I think the community group in Coronado has done a really successful job of that. We now have political leaders throughout the region at the state level, and also some of our congressional representatives that are on board with, quote unquote, finding a solution. Because although it bears the namesake of Coronado, the bridge is not maintained or operated by the city of Coronado or the city of San Diego. This is a state bridge. It's maintained by Caltrans. And we've had some preliminary conversations with Caltrans trying to express, making sure they're aware of the need to address this situation. And we've found them to be good partners. They are right now in the process of a feasibility study, which we expect to be complete in the spring of 2018. Mm-hmm. And once that study is complete, we will have identified several options. Most likely, it's going to be a barrier of some kind that's not visually obstructive as you drive across the bridge. And then from there, it'll be funding. And that might be the biggest challenge.
Well, Richard Bailey, Mayor of Coronado, really appreciate your time coming over.
Hey, thanks for having me.